Corruption in boxing here. Yeah, I know it's been a little while. Apologies to all. I know I've made promises about regular videos, but I will definitely try and adhere to what I've said in the past, but it's just a very difficult time at the moment. But enough of that. I wanted to talk about the return of Gennadiy Golovkin after 9 months fighting at a catchweight up against Steve Rolls, a pretty nondescript opponent, on a new platform with a new trainer as well. A lot of people, shedding on the fight and even the performance to a certain extent. But I felt a lot of these people are just focusing on the wrong aspects in deciding whether Golovkin is still a viable force in the middleweight division, and if he's able to compete against not only Canelo Alvarez, who has already fought twice, but any of the other pretenders who are coming up, whether it's a Jamal Charlo or Demetrius Andrade, or whether Billy Joe Saunders still has any desire on campaigning in the middleweight division. Now, Steve Rolls was from the Hard Knocks gym over in Toronto, which is supposed to be one of the better gyms over there. We produce, I wouldn't say world-class fighters, but certainly the best fighters in Toronto. Orthodox fighter who has campaigned at 168. Physically, he had a very long reach. He was considered a body puncher. I think 10 knockouts in 16 fights. But the footage I saw of him in the past, he looked a little bit of a dirty fighter. Somebody who was not shy on using elbows, even his head, holding one arm and hitting with another. So certainly some rough tactics on the inside. But he was an aggressive fighter, and I guess when Tom Luflo and DAZN were matchmaking, they wanted an opponent who would stand there and trade with Golovkin to try and make it a bit more of a fan-friendly fight. So, in terms of the style matchup, I guess it was good matchmaking. Now, Golovkin stopped his opponent in the 4th round, and the post-mortem it's mixed. A lot of people saying that Golovkin looked extremely slow, which I'm just disillusioned with. Gennadiy Golovkin was never a fighter who relied on speed to achieve victory in the past. Unlike, say, a Roy Jones Jr., some of these fighters, quick twitch, reflex-based fighters who rely on speed, arm punches generally. So speed it's just irrelevant in this context. Golovkin was always a fighter who had impeccable technique, excellent fundamentals, both defensively, tucking his chin in behind a tight guard. So, although fighters would be able to land on him, it's generally on the top of his head. But when you combine that with a granite chin, it didn't pose too much of a risk. A fighter with an excellent ability in cutting down the ring, because he was a predatory type of stalker, a hunter, and the icing on the cake would be his punching power. Early on in his career, certainly when he transitioned out of the amateurs, he would work far more on the body to try and break down an opponent. Mix head and body, but he would be able to stop his opponents with body shots as well. Very good left hook, very, very good right hand, and a world-class jab. So a fighter who had ability both in various facets. So that was Gennadiy Golovkin's sort of DNA as a fighter. Now, whenever a renowned fighter makes a comeback in his late 30s or 40s, or a veteran fighter is looking to extend his career, they're never going to be as fast as when they started out in their career. There isn't an inverse relationship between age and speed. Humans inevitably get slower. Their reflexes begin to slow down as well the older they get, especially after the age of 30. If the prime is generally considered between 20 and 30. So speed is irrelevant, as technique will always triumph over speed. But for this training camp now, Golovkin, we know, had an acrimonious sort of departure with Abel Sanchez, who he's been with for, I'm not sure how long, pretty much over a decade. Now Gennadiy decided to work with Jonathan Banks, who was very close with Vladimir Klitschko, who we all know started up the K2 promotions, which Gennadiy signed with. So there's a strong connection there. Now Jonathan Banks was always a defensive coach, which people seem to forget, implementing the blueprint that the late great Emmanuel Stewart had advocated from the Kronk gym. Not only on knockouts, but improving a fighter defensively, which he did certainly with Vladimir Klitschko after suffering some heartbreak defeats back in the Ukraine early on in his career when he was touted for great things. So Emmanuel Stewart literally stripped him down and worked on his basics and his fundamentals and improving those components. The ability to control distance, specializing on his key weapons, his jab, his straight right hand, learning to do the ugly stuff inside the pocket, even at short range, to neutralize the offense of his fighters. If it meant holding, clinching, aesthetically that may have not appeased fighters or fans who are looking for exciting fighters, but you've got to work with what you have, and you've got to try and specialize on the advantages you have. And Vladimir Klitschko after that became a formidable force for a number of years. But with Jonathan Banks here taking on Gennadiy at the age of 38, he saw that Gennadiy had become a little bit too static. Focusing too much on power punching, too much head hunting, not enough flexibility, not enough rhythm in his legs. So Jonathan Banks decided on using smaller sparring partners, sparring with welterweights, super middleweights, etc., to try and improve Gennadiy Golovkin's footwork, his rhythm, his dexterity, try and get him up on his toes, try and work some combinations, trying to get back to head and body, vary his punches. And certainly in this fight, there was evidence of that. In the first 2 rounds, Golovkin definitely was up on his toes. Steve Rolls was definitely very nervous. Had fought in New York before, but this was the biggest fight of his life, the biggest payday. And the nerves were evident in the first 2 rounds. He was operating behind a tight guard, whereas Golovkin was a lot more on his toes. Was using the jab, not really just start his attacks, but he was using it sometimes in between his attacks and trying to finish a power punch with a jab after. So trying to vary his offense, trying to give Steve Rolls a little bit more angles, given he's the younger fighter as well. Now, the key, as I mentioned before, the key when we're trying to critically assess whether a fighter is still a viable a viable fighter at a latter stage of his career is not speed, it's not even power, but it's his killer instinct and his ability still to push on the trigger. Vladimir Klitschko, we saw up against Tyson Fury, certainly, his last fight before Anthony Joshua, before he had a 2-year break. He clearly couldn't push the trigger. Yes, he was up against a very tricky, clever, a little bit slick, and a much larger athlete, somebody totally out of his general confines. So it was a bit of a shock to the system, and certainly Tyson Fury did psychologically get in his head and really just, took Vladimir Klitschko completely out of his comfort zone, didn't allow him to dictate the narrative, so it was a bit of a shock to the system. But even still, Vladimir, very experienced as fighting, in Germany, should have had the ability to control his emotions and deal with that sort of style, but he just couldn't pull the trigger. We've seen that with Roy Jones Jr. as well later on in his career. Bernard Hopkins, Oscar De La Hoya was somebody who really did struggle, and he commented it numerously, certainly in the Manny Pacquiao fight, that he just couldn't pull the trigger. So that's just a natural tendency for a fighter at that sort of later age in his life. But with Golovkin, from the 4th round, from hurting Steve Rolls, who was still operating behind a tight guard, using that reverse 1-2-1 combination, he was having some success on Golovkin, but Golovkin had no respect for his power. I think he was actually glad he had an opponent who was in front of him, who was able to exchange and trade with him, opened up. That's exactly what Golovkin wanted. But Golovkin was having a lot better of the exchanges, was landing some good combinations, that uppercut, left hook, which, a beautiful combination. I would have liked him to work a little bit more jabs, but certainly in the 4th round, as Steve Rolls began filling the body shots, and Gennadiy was using both the left hook to the body and the right hand to the body, and Rolls definitely felt the body shots in the 3rd round, came out in the 4th round, and he was behind a tight guard. So Gennadiy Golovkin went back to his old boxer tricks and used that overhand sort of sky hook, which he employed against Rubio when he won the WBC interim belt a number of years ago. A very clever punch selection, certainly to try and overcome somebody who's operating behind a tight guard. Golovkin was trying to persevere to penetrating the guard. Eventually he probably would have, because he's very heavy-handed, but he employed that left-handed sky hook, top of the head. Rolls was hurt, and this is where I judge Gennadiy Golovkin. From when he hurt his opponent, did he show any hesitation? What was his punch selection like? Did he show real killer instinct, a predatory instinct in trying to dispose of his victim? And no, he didn't. No hesitation. He came in straight away. Wasn't too reckless, wasn't smothering his work. Rolls still had his wits behind him a little bit, still had a reasonably tight guard, but he was back treating up against the ropes a little bit, trying to change levels, trying to get his upper body down, trying to roll the punches as well. But Gennadiy once again landed that sky hook, and then I think he did a very clever thing. His right foot, which is generally his back foot, it is an orthodox fighter, he brought that foot forward, almost changed his body position, so it looked like he was almost operating from a southpaw stance, waiting to see what Rolls was going to do, who moved his right hand, and Golovkin landed a left hook, sort of a looping punch to get around Steve Rolls. right hand from either a square or a southpaw position, which landed flush, and Steve Rolls just landed face first, and that was it for him. So within what, 25 seconds of hurting his opponent, Gennadiy knocked out a previously undefeated opponent within the same attack sequence. So that was actually very, very promising, very encouraging in terms of his viability, in terms of going forward. Defensively, he still needs to tighten up. Taking too many punches flush, but as I mentioned, sometimes you've got to maybe not allow, but you've got to use a little bit more psychological warfare tactics. You've got to allow your opponent to think that he's having some success, but if you're not feeling the punches, then bring a false sense of security, false level of confidence in your opponent. Allow him to open up to see whether your opponent is still defensively conscious as well. So it's a good tactic if you've got a very good chin. Fighters who are generally too defensive, don't really want to open up, they're always the hardest opponents to knock out. So Golovkin's chin is still very good. He's not taken a lot of punishment. He's hardly gone that many rounds over his career. Only the second Alvarez fight did he take punishment from rounds 1 to 12. Or he took a lot of flush punches, but nothing debilitating to the extent that he showed vulnerable signs of perhaps falling or, being knocked out. Nothing like that. He wasn't visibly hurt at any point. His face was definitely marked up, but he has a pale face, quite delicate skin, so the battle signs are going to be there. So that's not some sort of a definitive measure that a fighter's getting beaten up. People automatically look at the facial damage, but no, you've got to look at his punch output, you've got to look at his punching power, you've got to look at his stamina, his endurance, his ability to change angles. What's he doing? Is he still sticking to the game plan that was devised for him before? So there's too many variable components there, but Golovkin with Jonathan Banks, I liked what I was seeing in the pad work beforehand. Some aspects I liked Gennadiy being up on his toes again, working the body again as well, and I think the body work was actually a precursor to what happened in the fourth round, with Rolls actually feeling the body shots, bringing up the high guard, then Gennadiy going back to what he was doing before with the overhand sky hooks, to hurt his opponent and then going for the kill. So the stuff that they work with Jonathan Banks, I think, definitely had a positive factor in deciding the course of this fight. 2 or 3 more training camps, then we'll see. I'm sure we'll see some other variations with Golovkin as well. Hopefully we'll see, further improvements to its footwork as well. Hopefully defensively they can be better as well. Gennadiy really does need to go back to tucking that chin in, because he can't fight Alvarez like that as well. So that was the first, I believe, of a 6-fight deal. Not sure where Gennadiy is going to go next. In the post-fight, he was indicating that he wanted the Alvarez fight, which is inevitable because Alvarez has got 3 of the belts at 160, plus the Ring magazine and the Linear, so Plus it's the highest payday, so it doesn't take a genius to figure out what, you know, that is the fight Gennadiy wants. And he wants to avenge that defeat as well, you know. I like the attitude. I like the bright red, almost the old Soviet Union trunks. The Russian sort of acrylic back in his name with the IE. Gennadiy Golovkin. Conducting more interviews in Russian as well. You know, Gennadiy, he's not fucking around anymore, and fair enough, you know, the system has fucked him up twice. So, yeah, let him, you know, let him try and, you know, let him try and dictate the narrative now. Let him try and be the A side. See if he can finally get a little bit of justice. Certainly when they fight Alvarez, but that's going to be very difficult with. Certainly on the zone, as Alvarez is, you know, he's got the biggest payday. For Gennadiy Golovkin to even get a decision against Alvarez is going to be virtually impossible. He's got to have such a dominating performance like he did in the first fight. But even still, he couldn't get a decision in that fight in Vegas. So Golovkin would definitely prefer to fight in New York against Alvarez. As to when that fight happens, I'm not sure. There's not a lot of depth in the middleweight divisions. You know, Jamal Charlo, Demetrius Andrade. At one point, I thought Charlo maybe had a shot, but when you've effectively been outboxed and embarrassed by a 6-day replacement in Matvey Korobov, then your stock has just massively gone down. You know, he loved barking, but he had no bite. And Demetrius Andrade, you know, Jack Holke's probably his greatest opponent he's fought. Jack Holke's actually a very good, very underrated fighter. Excellent amateur. You know, gave Sergey Dermianchenko a very decent fight. He even gave Demetrius Andrade a good fight. By no means was that fight a comprehensive victory for Andrade. I thought it was a very close fight. Possibly even a 114. The Billy Joe Saunders, well, maybe that ship has just sailed. That fight should have happened a couple of years ago, but it didn't happen. So Saunders, who still expressed some desire to come back down to 160 pounds, but he's got no discipline, so I don't see that happening. He's better off remaining at 168 pounds, even though he's got no power to remain up there. So not really a lot that Golovkin can do. Is he going to rematch Danny Jacobs again? Any of these DAZN fighters? It's a possibility. Personally, I would love to see Golovkin up against with somebody like an Israel Madrimov, who's going to be a natural middleweight. You know, a guy who was on one of my prospects list at the start of the year. An Uzbek fighter. Very aggressive fighter. Almost looks like a young Golovkin coming up. But he's currently campaigning at 154 pounds. Had a long amateur career, over 315 fights. I'd love to see somebody like that. But maybe it's a little bit too early in his career, but I'm not really sure where Golovkin, what's next for him, but not a bad comeback. You know, some signs of encouragement. Very good knockouts. Show killer instinct, which is the most important. Speed and all of that other rubbish, you know, totally irrelevant aspects that don't mean nothing at all for a fighter who never exemplified speed in the first place. So if Golovkin's power had suddenly just gone out the window, then it becomes a concern, because power is one of, you know, that's his go-to tool eventually to finish off fighters. So, but the power is still there. So Golovkin hopefully will come back to 160, not at a catch weight. So we'll see what happens. But yeah, he's still got a future. He's still very competitive with an Alvarez. I think with 2 or 3 more camps, I wouldn't take the fight straight away. I'd take maybe a Dermianchenko next. That's a good fight. Even a Jack Colkay next. Start working your way up. Even take both of them one after the other. You know, you can certainly get 1 more fight at the end of this year, possibly even 2, given that this one only went 4. So try a Colkay first, then a Dermianchenko, then an Alvarez next year, Cinco de Mayo. Try and get the fight in New York. Try and control the narrative. Try and get some more neutral judges. Then let's see what happens, you know. But anyway, that's my thoughts. Let me know your thoughts on Golovkin's comeback. Is it negative, as a lot of people are on the internet kind of propagating at? But I don't think so, but it'd be nice to know your opinion. Put them down in the comments box, and I'll catch you for the next one. Corruption in Boxing. Sayonara, folks.